Jake's movements were instinctive. His feet found firm footing on the swaying train, and in a matter of seconds, he had closed the gap between himself and the man. The world around him seemed to slow, every detail sharpening in his mind. The child's tear-streaked face, the mother's trembling hands, the man's startled expression as he realized someone was watching. Jake's presence wasn't just noticed, it was felt, a commanding energy that filled the cramped subway car. The man froze for a moment, his grip loosening just slightly on the girl's arm. That was all Jake needed. With one hand, he grabbed the man's wrist firmly, but without unnecessary force, ensuring he didn't escalate the situation. "Let her go," Jake said, his voice calm but edged with authority. It wasn't loud, but it cut through the tension in the air like a knife. The man hesitated, his eyes darting between Jake and the girl's mother, who was now fully aware of the situation, but too shocked to move. "It's not what it looks like," the man stammered, his words spilling out quickly. I thought she dropped something. I was just helping." Jake's jaw tightened. He'd heard enough excuses in his time to recognize a lie when he saw one. The man's shifty demeanor, the deliberate way he had approached the girl, it all pointed to something far more sinister. But Jake also knew this wasn't a battlefield. He couldn't act on instinct alone. He needed to de-escalate while keeping everyone safe. "Then let her go," Jake repeated, his voice still steady, but now with a note of finality that left no room for argument. The man's hand released the girl's arm, and she quickly scrambled back into her mother's lap, clutching at her for safety. The mother finally found her voice, her words tumbling out in a mix of fear and anger. "What do you think you're doing? She's just a child." Her voice quivered, but there was a fierceness in her tone that matched the fire in her eyes. She wrapped her arms protectively around her daughter, glaring at the man as if her sheer willpower could force him to disappear. The other passengers had begun to react as well, some murmuring among themselves, others pulling out their phones to record the unfolding scene. Jake felt the weight of their gazes, the unspoken expectation that he would handle this. But he also knew the situation wasn't over. The man hadn't made a move to leave, and there was a tension in his posture that suggested he was still calculating his next step. Jake kept his grip firm on the man's wrist, his eyes locked on his face. "What's your name?" he asked, his tone calm but commanding. It was a question designed to disarm, to remind the man that he was being held accountable. The man hesitated, then mumbled something under his breath that Jake couldn't quite catch. Louder, Jake said, his patience thinning. "Alex," the man said finally, though it didn't sound convincing. Jake wasn't sure if that was the truth, but it didn't matter. He needed to keep the man talking, to maintain control of the situation until they reached the next station. "Alex, you need to step back," Jake said. "Take a seat and don't come near this girl again. Do you understand?" The man nodded reluctantly and shuffled backward, slipping into an empty seat near the door. Jake didn't let his guard down, keeping one eye on Alex and the other on the rest of the car. He could feel the tension beginning to ease, but he knew it wouldn't take much for it to spike again. The mother turned to Jake, her expression a mix of gratitude and lingering fear. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice barely audible over the hum of the train. Jake gave her a small nod. "You're safe now," he said, though he wasn't entirely sure that was true. His mind was already racing, trying to piece together the man's intentions. Was this a random act, or was there more to it? As the train slowed to a stop at the next station, Jake made a decision. He needed to make sure Alex didn't simply disappear into the crowd. "Stay here," he told the mother and her daughter, his tone reassuring. Then he turned his attention back to Alex. "Let's go," Jake said, gesturing for Alex to stand. The man hesitated, but eventually complied, his movements slow and reluctant. Jake led him off the train, keeping a firm but non-aggressive hand on his shoulder. The platform was busy, filled with the usual hustle and bustle of evening commuters. But Jake managed to guide Alex to a quieter corner away from the crowd. "You're not leaving until we sort this out," Jake said firmly. He wasn't a police officer, but he knew enough about the system to understand the importance of witnesses and accountability. He flagged down a transit worker and asked them to call the authorities, explaining the situation in concise but clear terms. Alex didn't protest, but his silence spoke volumes. He seemed resigned, as if he knew he'd been caught, but didn't have the energy or the will to fight back. Jake stayed close, his military training keeping him alert to any sudden movements. Back on the train, the mother held her daughter tightly, her mind racing with what could have happened if Jake hadn't been there. The other passengers began to settle back into their routines, though the air in the car still buzzed with the energy of what they had just witnessed. When the authorities arrived, Jake provided a detailed account of what had happened, his words measured and precise. The officers listened attentively, taking notes and asking questions. Alex remained silent, his head lowered as if he were trying to disappear. As Jake watched the man being escorted away, he felt a mix of relief and unease. He had done what he could to protect the little girl and her mother, but the encounter left him with questions that didn't have easy answers. Who was Alex, really? What had driven him to act the way he did? And most importantly, had Jake truly stopped something terrible from happening? Or had he just delayed it? The train pulled away from the station, carrying the mother and her daughter to safety. Jake stayed behind, watching as the platform emptied and the city continued on, indifferent to the events that had just unfolded. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of a much larger story. Jake stood on the platform long after the authorities had escorted Alex away. The usual clatter of the subway filled the air, but his mind was elsewhere. The situation felt unfinished, like a puzzle missing crucial pieces. He couldn't shake the unease gnawing at him. The man's behavior had been deliberate, calculated even, but Jake couldn't pinpoint why. There were too many unanswered questions. He replayed the encounter in his head. The way Alex had moved through the train, the way his eyes had locked on the little girl, it wasn't random. Jake had seen that kind of focus before, though it was usually in combat zones, not on public transportation. Something about it felt practiced, as though Alex wasn't acting alone. The thought sent a chill through him. Was there someone else involved? Was this part of something bigger? The mother's gratitude lingered in his mind, but so did her fear. It wasn't just the fear of what had happened. It was the fear of what could have happened. Jake knew that look well. He'd seen it on the faces of civilians in war zones, people who realized how close they'd come to losing everything. He didn't want to think about how close that little girl had come to being another statistic. As the platform emptied, Jake decided to follow up. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, but his instincts told him not to let it go. He made his way to the transit office, where a tired-looking clerk sat behind a counter, scrolling through a phone. Jake introduced himself and explained the situation, keeping his tone professional but firm. "Do you have security cameras on that train?" Jake asked. The clerk nodded. "Yeah, most cars have them now." "Why? You need footage." Jake hesitated. He wasn't law enforcement, and he didn't want to overstep. But he also couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that there was more to uncover. "I think it might help the authorities," he said finally. "Can you pull the footage from car 3 of the downtown line for the past hour?" The clerk raised an eyebrow, but Jake's no-nonsense demeanor seemed to convince him. "Give me a minute," the clerk said, disappearing into a back room. While he waited, Jake's phone buzzed. It was a message from a friend, a fellow Marine named Marcus who worked in private security. Jake debated for a moment before typing out a quick reply, asking Marcus if he'd heard of any recent incidents involving children on public transit. He didn't expect an immediate response, but it felt like a lead worth pursuing. The clerk returned a few minutes later with a USB drive in hand. "Here's the footage," he said. "You'll need to hand this over to the cops, though. I can't give it to just anyone." "Understood," Jake said, taking the drive. He thanked the clerk and made his way out of the station, his mind racing with possibilities. He didn't know what he'd find on the footage, but he had a sinking feeling it wouldn't bring him any peace. That night, Jake sat at his modest apartment, the USB drive plugged into his laptop. The footage was grainy, but clear enough to see the events play out again. He fast-forwarded to the part where Alex boarded the train, studying his movements carefully. The man's eyes weren't just scanning the car, they were searching. For what, Jake couldn't say, but it was clear Alex had a target in mind. Then Jake saw something that made his stomach tighten. Before Alex boarded the train, he glanced over his shoulder toward another man standing at the edge of the platform. The second man didn't get on the train, but his posture and gaze suggested he was watching, waiting. It was subtle, easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. But Jake's years of training had taught him to notice the details others overlooked. Who was the second man? And why hadn't he boarded the train? Jake rewound the footage and watched again, this time noting every detail he could. The man's height, build, clothing, and the way he seemed to communicate with Alex through a quick nod before the train doors closed. It wasn't much, but it was enough to convince Jake that Alex wasn't working alone. Jake leaned back in his chair, his mind churning. He had enough to take to the authorities, but he doubted they'd prioritize it without more evidence. Cases like this often slipped through the cracks, buried under the weight of bureaucracy and limited resources. Jake wasn't willing to let that happen. The next day, Jake reached out to Marcus, sharing what he'd found. "It doesn't sit right with me," Jake said over the phone. "There's more to this, I'm sure of it." Marcus listened carefully, his tone serious when he replied, "You might be onto something. There's been talk in the security circles about organized groups targeting public spaces, especially transit systems. It's not common, but it's not unheard of either. If this Alex guy isn't acting alone, you might have stumbled onto something bigger than you realize." Jake felt a knot form in his stomach. He had hoped Marcus would dismiss his concerns, tell him he was overthinking it. Instead, his friend's words only validated his fears. "What do you suggest?" Jake asked. "Gather what you can, but don't go it alone," Marcus advised. "If this really is part of a larger operation, you don't want to be in their crosshairs. I'll do some digging on my end, see if I can find any patterns or recent reports that match what you're describing." The next morning, Emily woke up to the sound of her phone buzzing incessantly on her bedside table. Rubbing her eyes, she reached for it and saw a flurry of notifications. Her social media accounts, which she barely used, were suddenly flooded with messages from strangers. Confused, she scrolled through them, catching glimpses of phrases like "You're so inspiring" and "We're rooting for you, Emily." Her heart raced as she tried to make sense of it. She opened one of the messages, a kind note from a woman who wrote about how much Emily's story resonated with her. Story? What story? Emily quickly clicked on the link attached to the message, and her stomach dropped when she realized it led to a video about her. The video had been posted on a popular community channel, and it featured a montage of her working at the gas station, laughing with customers, and even moments she didn't know anyone had captured, like the time she had helped an elderly man pump gas in the rain. The voiceover detailed her struggles as a pregnant woman working long hours, her resilience, and her kindness to everyone around her. But what truly caught her off guard was the end of the video. It showed Keanu Reeves speaking directly to the camera, his voice steady and heartfelt. Emily doesn't know I'm sharing this, but I felt compelled to. She's someone who embodies strength, perseverance, and compassion, even in the face of overwhelming challenges. I believe in helping those who inspire us, and I hope this will inspire others to do the same. The video ended with a link to a crowdfunding page titled "A Brighter Future for Emily and Her Baby." The goal was set high, higher than she could ever imagine. But to her shock, it was already halfway there, with thousands of people donating and leaving messages of support. Emily sat frozen, her mind struggling to keep up with what she had just seen. Keanu hadn't just set up a fund for her, he had shared her story with the world. And now, strangers from all over were rallying behind her in a way she never could have anticipated. Her phone buzzed again, and this time it was Sarah calling. Emily answered quickly, her voice trembling. "Sarah, have you seen this?" "Of course I've seen it," Sarah exclaimed. "It's everywhere. Emily, you're practically famous overnight. But are you okay? How do you feel about all this?" Emily didn't know how to answer. Part of her was overwhelmed with gratitude for the outpouring of support, but another part of her felt exposed. Her life, her struggles, they had been laid bare for the world to see. She hadn't asked for this. I don't know," she admitted. "It's just a lot. I mean, why would he do this? Why put me in the spotlight like that?" "Because he cares, Emily," Sarah said gently. "And because he saw something in you that the rest of us have always seen. You're worth it." Emily wasn't sure she believed that. But as the day went on, the messages and donations kept pouring in, and she couldn't deny the impact it was having. People were sharing their own stories of struggle, of overcoming adversity, and how Emily's story had given them hope. Still, the attention wasn't all positive. By evening, the first wave of backlash had arrived. A few skeptics began questioning the authenticity of the story, accusing Emily of milking her situation for sympathy, or even orchestrating the entire thing. One particularly harsh comment read, "Another sob story to manipulate people into giving money." I'm not buying it. Emily felt a knot form in her stomach as she read the negative comments. She knew she shouldn't let them get to her, but it was hard not to. Just as quickly as the support had come, so too had the judgment. When her phone buzzed again, she hesitated before answering. It was Keanu. She took a deep breath and picked up. "Hey, Emily," he said, his voice calm but tinged with concern. "I'm guessing you've seen the video by now." "Yeah," she said softly. "I don't know what to say, Keanu. I mean, thank you doesn't even feel like enough. But at the same time, I'm not sure I'm okay with all of this." "I get it," he said, his tone understanding. "I should have talked to you before sharing your story, and I'm sorry for putting you in this position. I wanted to help in the best way I knew how." Emily sighed, running a hand through her hair. "It's not that I'm ungrateful. I didn't ask for any of this. And now people are saying things that aren't true." Keanu was quiet for a moment before he spoke. "Unfortunately, there will always be people who doubt or criticize, no matter how genuine the story is. But Emily, this isn't about them. It's about the people who see you for who you are and want to support you. Don't let the negativity overshadow that." Jake thanked him and ended the call, feeling both reassured and more unsettled than ever. He wasn't afraid of confrontation. He'd faced far worse in his military career. But this was different. This wasn't a battlefield with clear lines and defined enemies. It was the murky, unpredictable terrain of urban life, where danger could lurk in the most unsuspecting places. As the days passed, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. It was subtle at first, a car idling a little too long outside his apartment, a figure lingering at the edge of his peripheral vision. He told himself he was being paranoid, but his instincts refused to quiet down. He'd stumbled into something he didn't fully understand, and the deeper he dug, the clearer it became that he was no longer just a witness. He was part of the story now, whether he liked it or not. And whatever was coming next, he knew it wouldn't be easy to face. The unease Jake felt only deepened in the days that followed. He kept replaying the events on the subway, the interactions he had seen in the footage, and the words Marcus had shared. Every detail pointed to something bigger, but the lack of clarity gnawed at him. He knew he was getting closer to something dangerous, yet he couldn't stop himself from digging further. It wasn't just about the little girl anymore. It was about all the others who might be at risk if he did nothing. Jake began spending his evenings researching. He combed through online forums, news archives, and even local police reports for anything that might connect Alex, or the second man on the platform, to a larger operation. At first, his search yielded little more than fragmented stories. A child reported missing from another subway line. A few cryptic posts about strangers behaving suspiciously on public transit. But as the pieces began to form a pattern, Jake's dread grew. One night, Marcus called with an update. "You're not going to like this," Marcus said, his voice grim. "I've been digging into Alex. He's been flagged before. Nothing major, just a few run-ins with the law. Petty theft, loitering. But here's the kicker. His name showed up in an old investigation into a suspected human trafficking ring. It went cold a couple of years ago, but it was never officially closed." Jake felt the air leave his lungs. Human trafficking. The words hit him like a punch to the gut. He'd seen the horrors of it during his deployments overseas, but the idea that it could be happening here, in the city he now called home, felt surreal. "Do we know if he's still connected?" Jake asked, his voice tight. "That's the thing," Marcus said. "There's no solid evidence tying him to anything recent, but his movements suggest he might still be in the game. And if he's working with someone else, like the guy you spotted on the platform, this could be part of something bigger." Jake's mind raced. The signs had been there all along, but now they felt impossible to ignore. The deliberate way Alex had targeted the little girl, the subtle nod to the second man, it all pointed to a coordinated effort. "We need to stop this," Jake said, his determination hardening. If they're targeting kids on the subway, they're not going to stop at one. The next day, Jake returned to the subway station where it all began. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, but he trusted his instincts to guide him. The platform was crowded, filled with the usual mix of commuters and tourists. Jake scanned the faces, looking for anything, or anyone, that seemed out of place. His military training had taught him to spot patterns, to notice the small inconsistencies that others might overlook. That's when he saw him, the second man from the footage. He was standing near the edge of the platform, his posture casual but his eyes constantly scanning the crowd. Jake's pulse quickened. The man was here, just as Jake had suspected. But what was he waiting for? Jake kept his distance, careful not to draw attention to himself. He boarded the same train as the man, staying a few cars back to avoid being seen. As the train sped through the city, Jake's focus never wavered. The man wasn't just riding aimlessly. He was watching, waiting. And Jake knew he needed to find out why. At the next station, the man stepped off, blending into the crowd. Jake followed, maintaining a safe distance as they exited the station and entered the busy streets above. The man moved with purpose, weaving through the throngs of people with a practiced ease. Jake stayed close, his heart pounding with a mix of adrenaline and determination. The man turned down a narrow alley, and Jake hesitated for a moment before following. The alley was dimly lit, the sounds of the city muffled by the towering buildings on either side. Jake's senses were on high alert, every nerve in his body ready for whatever might come next. Halfway down the alley, the man stopped and turned. Jake froze, his heart skipping a beat as their eyes met. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then the man smirked, a slow, calculated expression that sent a chill down Jake's spine. "I was wondering when you'd show up," the man said, his voice calm but laced with menace. "You've been watching me, haven't you?" Jake didn't respond immediately. He was weighing his options, calculating the risks. The alley was empty, but he couldn't be sure they were truly alone. "Who are you?" Jake asked, his voice steady despite the tension crackling in the air. The man tilted his head, his smirk widening. "That's not the question you should be asking," he said. "The real question is, do you know what you've gotten yourself into?" Before Jake could reply, the sound of footsteps echoed from behind him. He turned to see two more men emerging from the shadows, their faces hard and unwelcoming. Jake's pulse quickened. He was outnumbered, but he wasn't outmatched. Years of training had prepared him for situations like this, and he knew how to stay calm under pressure. The first man stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. "You've been poking around where you don't belong," he said. "I suggest you walk away before you get hurt." Jake's jaw tightened. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him, but he refused to back down. "I'm not going anywhere," he said firmly. "Whatever you're doing, it ends here." The man chuckled, a low, menacing sound that echoed through the alley. "You don't know who you're dealing with," he said, "but you're about to find out." Jake's muscles tensed as the men closed in, the tension in the alley reaching a breaking point. He knew he was standing on the edge of something dangerous, something that could change everything. And as the shadows deepened around him, he prepared for whatever was about to come next. The tension in the alley was suffocating, each second stretching into an eternity as Jake calculated his next move. His heart pounded in his chest, but his mind remained sharp, instincts honed from years of training. The three men surrounded him now, their stances firm, their intent unmistakable. Jake could see it in their eyes. This wasn't a simple warning. They were here to make sure he wouldn't interfere again. "You've got one last chance to walk away," the man in front of him said, his voice calm but cold. "Turn around and forget you ever saw us." Jake's gaze flicked between them, assessing their positions, their builds, the way they carried themselves. They weren't amateurs. These were men who knew how to handle themselves in a fight, which meant they weren't just petty criminals. They were organized, deliberate, and Jake had no doubt they were connected to Alex. "I can't do that," Jake said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "You're hurting people, kids, and I'm not going to stand by and let it happen." As the first man lunged, Jake moved with precision, sidestepping the attack and using the momentum to throw him off balance. The alley erupted into chaos, fists flying, the sound of impacts echoing off the walls. Jake's training took over, every movement calculated, every strike purposeful. But as skilled as he was, the numbers weren't in his favor, and he knew he couldn't keep this up for long. One of the men pulled a knife, the blade glinting in the dim light. Jake barely dodged the swipe, his focus narrowing as he fought to disarm him. The struggle was intense, each second feeling like an hour, but Jake's determination didn't waver. He couldn't afford to lose, not here, not now. Just as he managed to knock the knife from the man's hand, a new sound cut through the fight, the wail of a police siren in the distance. The men froze for a moment, their eyes darting toward the street beyond the alley. Jake didn't waste the opportunity, using the distraction to regain his footing and create some distance. The first man cursed under his breath, signaling to the others. "Let's go," he said sharply, and before Jake could react, they were gone, disappearing into the shadows as quickly as they'd appeared. Jake leaned against the wall, catching his breath as the sirens grew louder. Relief mixed with frustration. He'd survived, but he'd also lost his chance to get answers. Moments later, a police car pulled up at the mouth of the alley. An officer stepped out, her hand resting on her holstered weapon as she approached. "Sir, are you all right?" she asked, her tone professional but concerned. "I'm fine," Jake said, straightening up. "They got away, though." "Who?" the officer asked, her brow furrowing. Jake hesitated. He wanted to explain everything, but he knew how it would sound. An ex-Marine chasing a group of men he suspected were part of a trafficking ring. Without solid evidence, it could come off as paranoid at best, delusional at worst. "Just some guys causing trouble," he said finally. They didn't take too kindly to me stepping in. The officer studied him for a moment before nodding. "We'll take a look around. You should get checked out, though. Looks like you took a few hits." Jake nodded, thanking her before walking away. His body ached, and his mind was racing, but he couldn't stop now. The men had confirmed what he'd suspected all along. They were part of something bigger, something dangerous. And the fact that they'd been willing to confront him so directly meant he was getting too close for their comfort. As Jake made his way home, his phone buzzed in his pocket. It was Marcus. Jake answered, his voice low as he recounted what had just happened. "You're lucky you made it out," Marcus said, his tone serious. "These guys don't play around. But listen, I found something else. There's a warehouse on the edge of town that's been flagged before in similar investigations. It's off the books, no official records, but people have reported suspicious activity there. If they're moving kids, it could be a hub." Jake's grip tightened on the phone. A warehouse. It made sense, an isolated location where they could operate without prying eyes. "Where is it?" he asked. Marcus hesitated. "Jake, you can't go alone. These people are dangerous, and if they're running an operation out of there, they won't hesitate to take you out." "I'll be careful," Jake said, his resolve unshakable. "Just tell me where to find it." After a long pause, Marcus gave him the address. "Promise me you'll call for backup," he said. "Even if it's me. Don't try to be a hero." Jake nodded, though he knew he couldn't make that promise. This was personal now. He wasn't just chasing a lead. He was fighting for the safety of those who couldn't protect themselves. As he hung up the phone, a new sense of determination settled over him. The stakes had never been higher, but Jake was ready to face whatever lay ahead. That night, as he prepared for what could be his most dangerous mission yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The men in the alley, the warehouse, the operation, it was all connected, part of a web that stretched further than he could see. And somewhere in that web were the answers he was determined to find, no matter the cost. Jake stood outside the warehouse, his breath visible in the cold night air. The building loomed ahead, dark and foreboding, surrounded by silence. From the outside, it looked abandoned, but Jake knew better. Every instinct told him this was the place, the hub Marcus had warned him about. He tightened his grip on the flashlight he carried, its weight grounding him as he moved toward the side entrance. The door was rusted, but it gave way easily, creaking as Jake stepped inside. The air was heavy with the scent of mildew and oil, and the faint hum of machinery buzzed in the distance. Jake moved quietly, his footsteps muffled against the concrete floor. The faint glow of light seeped through cracks in the walls, leading him deeper into the building. He reached a large room filled with crates stacked to the ceiling. Most were labeled with codes and shipping numbers, but a few were marked with strange symbols Jake didn't recognize. He scanned the room, looking for signs of movement, and that's when he heard it. a faint sound, almost like a whimper. His heart tightened as he followed the noise, each step bringing him closer to what he feared most. Tucked in the corner was a small cage, barely large enough for a child to sit upright. Inside, a little girl huddled, her face pale and streaked with tears. Jake recognized her immediately. It was the same girl from the subway. Relief flooded him, but it was quickly replaced by a surge of anger. Whoever was behind this had crossed a line. "Hey, it's okay," Jake whispered, crouching near the cage. "I'm here to help you." The girl's eyes widened, a flicker of hope replacing the fear. Jake inspected the lock on the cage. It was sturdy but old. He could break it, but he'd need time. As he worked, the sound of voices echoed from a nearby hallway. Jake froze, his pulse quickening. He wasn't alone. The voices grew louder, accompanied by footsteps. Jake glanced around, searching for cover. He spotted a stack of crates nearby and quickly moved behind them, signaling to the girl to stay quiet. Moments later, two men entered the room, their conversation casual but their presence intimidating. Jake recognized one of them immediately. It was Alex. "We're moving out tonight," Alex said, his tone curt. "Cops are sniffing around too much. We can't risk staying here." "What about the kid?" the other man asked. The little girl from the subway, Mia, stayed in his thoughts. After the raid, Jake learned her story, a heartbreaking tale of being separated from her family and thrust into a world she couldn't understand. Her parents had been searching for her for weeks, desperate for answers. When they were finally reunited, Jake couldn't help but feel a lump in his throat as he watched their tearful embrace. It was moments like that which made everything worth it. But not every ending was as neat. The network was larger than Jake had imagined, with ties to people in positions of power who had a vested interest in keeping things hidden. Some leads ran cold, and some fights were lost to bureaucracy. It was frustrating, but Jake had learned to take victories where he could find them. Change, he realized, didn't happen all at once. It was a series of small, determined steps. One evening, as Jake sat on a park bench overlooking the city skyline, he reflected on how much his life had changed. He left the Marines thinking his days of fighting were behind him, but he found a new purpose. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't always clear where the path would lead, but it felt right. He wasn't just reacting to the world around him. He was making it better, one action at a time. Marcus joined him on the bench, holding 2 cups of coffee. "Thought you could use this," he said, handing one to Jake. "Thanks," Jake said, taking a sip. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the city's lights twinkling in the distance. "You ever think about what's next?" Marcus asked finally. "All the time," Jake admitted. "There's always going to be another fight, another person who needs help. I just have to take it one day at a time." Marcus nodded. "Well, for what it's worth, you've got people who've got your back. You're not in this alone." That thought stayed with Jake as he continued his work. He wasn't a lone soldier anymore. He was part of something bigger. People like Marcus, the officers who raided the warehouse, and even the families of the rescued children, they were all part of the fight. Together, they could push back against the darkness. Months later, Jake found himself back on the subway, the same route where it had all started. He glanced around, watching the other passengers go about their lives, unaware of the battles being fought to keep them safe. He didn't need recognition or thanks. Knowing he'd made a difference was enough. As the train pulled into a station, Jake spotted Mia and her parents on the platform. She was laughing, holding her mother's hand as her father carried a bag of groceries. They looked happy, normal, like any other family. Jake felt a wave of quiet satisfaction. He hadn't saved the world, but he'd saved her world, and that was enough. When the train started moving again, Jake leaned back in his seat, a small smile on his face. The fight wasn't over, it might never be over, but he was ready for whatever came next. Because sometimes all it took to make a difference was one person willing to act, one moment of courage in the face of fear. And Jake knew he had plenty more moments left to give. "Take her with us. She's worth too much to leave behind," Alex replied. Jake's fists clenched. He wanted to act, to take them down right there, but he knew he needed a plan. The men moved closer to the cage, and Jake braced himself, preparing to strike. Just as Alex reached for the lock, Jake stepped out from behind the crates, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. "That's far enough," Jake said, his voice steady. The men froze, their surprise quickly turning to anger. "You again," Alex snarled, his hand reaching for something inside his jacket. "Don't," Jake warned, his voice sharp. "You make a move, and this ends badly for you." For a moment, the tension was unbearable, the room silent except for the hum of machinery. Then Alex smirked. "You're outnumbered," he said. "You really think you're walking out of here?" Jake didn't flinch. "I'm not the one who should be worried," he said. The sound of sirens filled the air, growing louder with each passing second. Alexa's smirk faltered as the realization dawned. Jake had called Marcus before entering the warehouse, giving him the location and a full account of what was happening. The police were closing in. "You tipped them off," Alex hissed, his tone venomous. "You bet I did," Jake said. "This ends here." The room erupted into chaos as Alex lunged at Jake, a knife glinting in his hand. Jake dodged, his training kicking in as he countered the attack. The second man joined in, but Jake held his ground, every movement precise and deliberate. The fight was brutal, but Jake's determination never wavered. He wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for the little girl and every other child who might have fallen into their hands. As the sirens reached their peak, the door burst open and officers flooded the room. The men tried to flee, but there was nowhere to go. Within moments, Alex and his accomplice were handcuffed and dragged away. Jake sank to his knees, exhaustion finally catching up to him. An officer approached the cage and gently freed the girl, wrapping her in a blanket. She clung to Jake, her small frame trembling. "You're safe now," Jake said softly, his voice filled with relief. "It's over." But just as he began to feel the weight lift, one of the officers approached him, his expression grave. "We found something else," the officer said, holding out a piece of paper. Jake took it, his eyes scanning the list of names and locations scrawled across the page. His stomach dropped. "This wasn't their only operation," Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper. The realization hit him like a freight train. He'd stopped one hub, but there were others out there, just as dangerous, just as active. As the girl was taken to safety and the warehouse was secured, Jake stood alone, the list clutched in his hand. He'd won this battle, but the war was far from over. And as the first rays of dawn broke through the darkness, Jake made a silent vow. He wouldn't stop until every child was safe, no matter how long it took. Jake stood outside the warehouse, watching as the flashing red and blue lights painted the scene in sharp contrasts. Officers moved in and out, cataloging evidence, securing the area, and ensuring the girl was taken care of. The cold night air brushed against his face, but he barely felt it. His mind was spinning, still processing everything that had just happened. The adrenaline had worn off, leaving behind exhaustion and a gnawing sense of unfinished business. The little girl had been taken to safety, but Jake couldn't forget the list of names and locations he'd seen. Each line on that paper represented someone else in danger, another operation waiting to be uncovered. It was overwhelming to think about how vast the network might be, but he knew he couldn't let that paralyze him. He had already made a difference tonight, and that meant something. Marcus arrived on the scene, his face a mix of relief and exasperation. "You could have told me you were going in alone," he said, shaking his head. "Do you ever stop to think about how dangerous this is?" Jake managed a tired smile. "Didn't have much of a choice. If I waited, they might have moved her." Marcus sighed, but there was admiration in his eyes. "You did good, Jake. The girl's safe because of you. But this is just the tip of the iceberg. That list, it's a roadmap to something much bigger." Jake nodded, glancing back at the warehouse. "I know, and we're going to stop it." For the next few days, Jake worked closely with Marcus and the authorities, piecing together the information they'd gathered. The list led them to additional locations, some already abandoned, others still active. Each raid brought its own challenges, but with every operation, more lives were saved, and the network began to crumble. Jake didn't do it for recognition or glory. He did it because he knew what was at stake. Every child rescued was a reminder of why he couldn't give up.